views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Open BXRx, BronxNet's special coverage providing you the latest information, resources, services, and community efforts taking place locally here in the Bronx and virtually throughout the pandemic. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, and today is Tuesday, October 20th. Coming up, we'll discuss a new report by Human Rights Watch claiming that the NYPD planned assault on Bronx protesters in Mott Haven back in June. Then, Montefiore doctors join us to share more about the importance of evidence-based treatment for opioid use disorder during Addiction Treatment Week, taking place between October 19th to October 25th. After that, we'll be joined by filmmaker Llácer to discuss her film, Uma, a water crisis in Bolivia. And stay tuned to find out more about the Hostos Cultural Center's first 3D virtual art exhibition, Shifting Streams. So please, stay tuned. Open BXRx starts now. Welcome to Open BXRx on BronxNet. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, inviting you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. On June 4th, 2020, what began as a nonviolent protest and march in the South Bronx turned into violent mass arrests. A new Human Rights Watch report found that the police response to the peaceful Mott Haven protest was intentional, planned, and unjustified. Joining us now to discuss this report and more is Ida Sawyer. Ida is the Acting Crisis and Conflict Director at Human Rights Watch. Welcome, Ida. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. Just for those who are not familiar, can we start just with an about Human Rights Watch and your mission there?
Yeah, so Human Rights Watch is an international non-governmental organization, and we work in over 90 countries around the world, documenting, investigating human rights abuses, and then we publish reports and conduct advocacy and push for justice for those responsible for abuses to be held to account and for policies to change to put an end to systemic human rights abuses.
Thank you, Ida. Now, on to the Mott Haven protest. Can you please walk us through what happened that day on June 4th in Mott Haven and what the violent tactics used against protesters by the NYPD were?
So what we documented is that this began as a peaceful march through the Mott Haven neighborhood on June 4th in the early evening. There was first people gathered at the hub on 149th and 3rd Avenue, and some of the organizers gave speeches, and then they began walking through the neighborhood entirely peacefully, pointing out different landmarks, including La Mirada restaurant, for example, which was giving up to 1,200 free meals a day to vulnerable community members. They walked through the Patterson houses, and then eventually at just about 10 minutes before the 8 p.m. curfew, which had been imposed a few days earlier because of looting in other parts of the city, not at all in that neighborhood. But then just before this curfew hit, scores of police officers all of a sudden surrounded and trapped the protesters. So they used a tactic known as kettling. There was a line of police officers on bikes in front who held up their bikes to form a wall and prevent people from going forward. And then another line of police officers came in behind them, preventing them from turning around and going back in the direction they came from. And this was on a pretty narrow, small road. There were parked cars on either side and no way for people to escape on the sides. So they were trapped. And then just after 8 p.m., the police, entirely unprovoked and without warning, they moved in on the protesters, wielding batons, beating people from car tops, shoving them to the ground, and firing pepper spray directly into people's faces. And then they rounded up more than 250 people for arrest. So the police blocked people from leaving before the curfew, and then they used this curfew as an excuse to beat, abuse, and arrest people who were peacefully protesting. And in our research, we documented at least 61 cases of protesters, legal observers, and bystanders who sustained injuries during the crackdown. This included lacerations, a broken nose, a lost tooth, a sprained shoulder, broken finger, many black eyes, and potential nerve damage due to overly tight zip ties. And what made it even worse was that most of those injured did not receive any immediate medical care. And this was because the police arrested or obstructed the volunteer medics who had deployed to the protest. They were wearing medical scrubs. They had Red Cross insignia, on their shirts, and they were also arrested, many of them, or blocked from providing care for those who were injured. So that left dozens of people who spent, in the end, hours in detention with untreated wounds and their hands bound behind their backs. We also documented that at least 13 legal observers who also wearing clearly identifiable hats and badges, they were also detained, in some cases violently, before being released. And in the video that we produced, we included footage which captures an official from the NYPD Legal Bureau instructing other officers, legal observers can be arrested, they're good to go. And this is despite the fact that the mayor's office had given clear guidance before this protest that legal observers were indeed exempt from the curfew and allowed to be out. So in total, we documented at least 263 people who were taken to jail after this protest. This is more than at any other protest since George Floyd's killing. Some were released later that night, others the next afternoon, and one was held for an entire week.
Thank you, Ida, for sharing the details of what happened that day. I was there on June 4th myself. While I didn't have media credentials on me, I managed to escape through a side street as soon as the NYPD corralled us in the same way that you described. It was the kettling. In the street, we saw cops come down the road on bikes that day. And I don't know how I escaped. It was a very scary moment, one of the most frightening in my early journalistic career. We'll definitely show some clips of that moment and overhead footage by a NYCHA resident of Mitchell Houses. Ida, can you tell us, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio and NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea acknowledged that the arrests were pre-planned and accused the protesters of encouraging violence. Was there any evidence of violence on the protesters' side that day?
So for our research, we reviewed 155 videos that were taken during the protest from all vantage points from the start to the finish. We also interviewed or reviewed accounts from 81 participants, people who were present during the protest, and we interviewed a number of other officials, lawyers, and others. And through all of this research, we found no evidence of any violence or threats of violence or vandalism on the part of the protesters or the organizers. To the contrary, we found it was entirely peaceful, and the only violence was in the police response when they stopped the protest from continuing.
Thank you, Ida. Many protesters felt that the police targeted this Mott Haven community. Can we discuss the demographics in Mott Haven where the protest took place?
Yeah, so this protest took place in Mott Haven in the South Bronx, which is a neighborhood that has experienced some of the more damaging consequences of systemic racism and the government's really over-reliance on criminalization and policing to address societal problems, and many of the same reasons that people were out on the streets protesting on June 4th. It's a majority Black and Brown community. It has some of New York City's and really some of the country's highest rates of poverty and homelessness. It was also one of the neighborhoods hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was, of course, the height of the pandemic in New York. And we've also found that Mott Haven has long been aggressively over-policed for low-level crimes. And there have been more complaints about the use of physical force by police officers have been made in Mott Haven's 40th precinct than in any of New York City's other 76 precincts.
Has the NYPD responded to Human Rights Watch addressing the violent tactics and kettling that took place that day?
Yeah, so we sent a letter to the NYPD before our report was published, and they responded in part to our questions. They described they repeated some of the allegations that Commissioner Shea had made earlier, saying that this protest was an attempt by outside agitators to cause mayhem, tear down society, to injure cops. Again, they did not provide any specific evidence of this. Some of the allegations that they made were actually contradicted by other police officials, including about a firearm and gasoline that they claimed were found on the protesters. Other officials said gasoline was actually found the day earlier somewhere else in the Bronx, and the firearm was recovered over a half-mile away an hour before the protest began, and there was no clear connection with either to the protest. They also said in their response to our questions, they said that the protest was unlawful starting when the curfew began, and that therefore they could arrest people who were out after the curfew. But they did not address the fact that they trapped people and did not provide them any opportunity to disperse even before the curfew began. And the mayor's curfew order was very clear that if people were out, they should be given the opportunity to disperse and to go home. And this opportunity was clearly not given to the protesters in Mott Haven. And lastly, the NYPD also repeated this claim that the legal observers were not exempt from curfew, very clearly contradicting what the mayor's office had said and what the mayor has since confirmed, that legal observers are indeed exempt.
Right. And Ida, essential workers were also arrested during these protests as well, no? That same exact day, the report finds?
Yes, so we also found a few cases of essential workers who were just on their way home from work or going to work and in the same area as the protest, and they were also rounded up for arrest. And one of those was a person who ended up being held for an entire week after the protest.
Ida, what's next? What are the protesters and Human Rights Watch calling for after this report?
So we have urged Mayor Bill de Blasio, first of all, to take immediate action to show that there are consequences for such violence and abuse, and including the deliberate mischaracterization of what occurred, which we saw Commissioner Shea doing. And I think this incident made it clear that the NYPD might act as if it's above the law, but Mayor de Blasio does have the authority to take action, and we've urged him to do so. And we believe that these consequences should include appropriate disciplinary action, including possible dismissal of Police Commissioner Shea and the Chief of Department, Terrence Monahan, who's the highest ranking NYPD officer, and he was present on the scene during this crackdown, and he led this abusive operation. And then we've also said if the mayor fails to take action, then he too should be held to account. But what we also find in our report is that this incident reveals much deeper systemic problems of a police force that encourages and condones violence and abuse, that fuels impunity, and that this behavior is really modeled by top commanders. And so we feel that this really shows the importance of the protesters' bigger demands and the need for structural changes to reduce the role of police in addressing societal problems. This should include significant decreases to the police force size and budget, and the government should instead invest in the real needs of communities like Mott Haven, including through support to services that directly address underlying issues like homelessness and poverty, and that improve access to quality education and healthcare. And lastly, this incident also shows the dire need for changes to empower independent accountability systems to provide a real check on police misconduct.
Thank you so much, Ida, for sharing. In the annex letter from the NYPD to Human Rights Watch, I did read that, let's see, hold on a sec. Ernest F. Hart, the Deputy Commissioner of Legal Matters, stated that the Human Rights Watch does not take into account the NYPD. What does the Human Rights Watch respond to that query about, this is the exact quote: "I believe any inquiry into the performance of NYPD officers during this challenging time must also account for this reality. Given the mission of your organization, the rights of these human beings, members of the NYPD, should not be discounted simply because they wore a uniform and dedicated their lives to public service." What does the HRW respond to this claim?
So we did look at what if any injuries happened to police officers during this incident. We specifically asked the police department if there were any injuries. They did not respond to that question. They did mention in their response, as you alluded to, that other police officers were injured during other protests. But as I mentioned, during this specific protest, which our report focused on, we did not find any evidence of violence on the part of protesters or of police officers being injured. But that is something that we looked into.
Thank you again, Ida, for joining us. Ida Sawyer, Acting Crisis and Conflict Director at Human Rights Watch. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Folks, to see the full report, you can visit hrw.org and click reports. We'll be right back.
Who's most at risk for coronavirus? People over 65, people with underlying medical conditions like heart disease, chronic lung disease, asthma, diabetes, people undergoing cancer treatment, and people with weakened immune systems. What should you do if you or a loved one is at higher risk? Avoid close contact with people, avoid crowds, stay home if you can, wash your hands frequently, learn more ways to protect yourself and others at coronavirus.gov.
Welcome back. National Addiction Treatment Week takes place between October 19th to the 25th. According to the NYC Department of Health, overdose deaths in New York City remain at epidemic levels. In the first quarter of the year, 331 New Yorkers died from overdose. Sadly, the most deaths were here in the Bronx. During the pandemic, physicians continue to help reduce harm and treat opioid use disorder, helping people get medications they need with flexibility and telemedicine. Joining us now to discuss are two Montefiore doctors, Dr. Kristine Torres-Lockhart and Dr. Tiffany Liu. Welcome. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today.
Thank you for
Thanks for
having us.
having us.
Of course. So first, to start off, can you please help us define what opioid use disorder is?
Sure, I can do that. It's a great question. As you mentioned, the opioid crisis is sort of raging everywhere in the United States, including here in the Bronx. And so it's really common. And so I take care of patients who have opioid use disorder, both in the primary care setting and also in our methadone treatment programs here at Montefiore. And opioid use disorder really is a chronic medical illness, just like we think about hypertension or diabetes. And it's really characterized by changes in our brain chemistry that cause patients to really use substances despite having negative consequences from that drug use. So that can really mean having medical complications from their drug use, or maybe it's affecting their interpersonal relationships with their family and friends, or affecting their work life as well.
Thank you, Dr. Torres-Lockhart. And what treatments are available for opioid use disorder?
Sure. And so despite the fact that we are actually in an opioid crisis, we have some very effective medical treatments. And so one of the treatments is actually medication therapy. And the two most common ones that we use in our clinics, whether it's the 6 primary care clinics across Montefiore or our 5 methadone treatment programs, are methadone and buprenorphine. And so these medications have been really well studied for many, many years, and they've been shown to decrease overdoses, to really save lives, to decrease substance use, and also really decreases the risk of hepatitis C and HIV transmission for patients that use drugs. And so for methadone, this is a special medication that can only be provided in certain methadone clinics. And so, like I said, Montefiore has 5 of those across the Bronx where we see patients. And it's just a medication that's taken every day by mouth. In addition, buprenorphine, which is also commonly referred to by the trade name Suboxone. And that can be a medication that can be prescribed by any provider with a special license. And we have 6 different primary care clinics that also provide that medication. And again, it's just a medication taken by mouth and dissolved under the tongue. And so both of these medications are provided at our many different sites, and we actually take care of over 4,000 different Bronx residents who have opioid use disorder right now in our programs.
Wow. As we stated in the introduction, over 331 New Yorkers have died from overdose this year alone. And here in the Bronx, those rates are most of the rates are here in the Bronx. I wanted to ask, has opioid use and abuse increased during the pandemic? If so, is there an explanation medically for that?
That's a great question. So, and thank you for having me. So I'm a primary care-based addiction medicine specialist, and I oversee our buprenorphine treatment services in our primary care clinics. And with that, one of our missions has to really pay attention to overdose prevention effort, integration into a medical system. And so during the pandemic, what I saw in our services was that the opioid epidemic very much has been real and never went away. But in order to really help patients keep up with safer opioid use during the pandemic, we had to think about the fact that the pandemic was really causing people additional stressors, and that may be related to as a trigger for additional substance use. So now, if you can imagine, during the pandemic, we've had to isolate more at home. And so by being alone, some people may feel worsened mood and therefore more of a drive to use drugs. And for some of our Bronx-based patients who are not actually living in their own homes, maybe they're in congregate settings that may feel unsafe, and that actually lends itself to additional COVID transmission risk as well as overdose risk if they're more primed to use when they're with other people.
Thank you, Dr. Lu. Can you also tell us a little bit more about the surge in opioid deaths here in the Bronx? What are the demographics of these deaths here in our borough?
So what we know is that over the last 20 years in the Bronx, we've always seen a higher burden of drug-related overdose deaths compared to the rest of the New York City. And then the last decade, when national attention really turned to this being a major U.S. crisis, we continue to see those numbers climb in the Bronx. And it's really a complex question that reflects the legacy of the war on drugs, the way that drug use is stigmatized and criminalized in our communities, but specifically in the Bronx, as other parts of the city, the major driver of recent overdose deaths related to opioids has to do with something called illicitly made fentanyl. So basically, that's not fentanyl that's prescribed by a medical provider to treat pain, but rather it's fentanyl that is made by the drug trade manufacturers. And why it's so attractive is that you only need a small bit of it, this white substance that can be cut into different street supplies to achieve a level of a euphoria, or as we say commonly, it's known as a high. So it's very potent and easy to disguise. So what this really means for the average person who may use drugs is that they may not be seeking out the fentanyl, but everything they use in their drug supply can be contaminated. Because fentanyl is a very potent opioid, it can really cause someone to suffer an overdose just without knowing that they're at risk. So this is actually a huge point that we use to educate patients as well as their loved ones that you know, even before you realize you have a problem and is ready to get treatment for opioid use disorder, that the bigger problem is being aware of the contaminated drug supply and being able to do something about it.
Thank you, Dr. Lu. So doctors, I have heard about a treatment for overdoses. It's called naloxone. Can you tell us what this is and who can administer it in an emergency situation and how we can do that safely during COVID-19?
I'm so glad you asked about naloxone because this is what I think of as the low-hanging fruit that everybody has access to. So naloxone specifically, it's a medication that's used in emergency purposes to reverse opioid overdose or the effects of opioids. So in New York State, it's been completely legal since 2006 for anybody who doesn't even have medical training to be able to learn about naloxone, access it, and carry it around in case of an emergency. So in New York City, these naloxone medications can be accessed in different ways. And one way is through pharmacies as well as medical programs and community-based services that are signed up to provide free naloxone training and kits. So for example, at Montefiore, we operate this integrated overdose prevention program in which we actually give patients free take-home kits, as well as provide them the necessary training if they come into our hospital system, if they receive primary care. And actually, we also have an arm of our services that interact with community-based organizations, as well as just any community member who's interested in learning about naloxone. So like I said, it's legal and it's free, and it really helps save lives. And I'm happy to connect anybody interested here with resources at Montefiore if they're interested.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. When we talk about steering away from the stereotypes and the stigma that come associated with opioid use, how can we all engage in a conversation to have a little more empathy for someone who perhaps is addicted to opioids?
Yeah, so that's really such a great question. I think historically opioid use and any type of drug use has always been thought of as an individual's personal or problem, or something related to their morals. And really what we know about the disease of opioid use disorder is that it's a chronic illness, just like so many other diseases that we see in our society. And so I think the first thing to do is recognize that there's a medical and scientific basis behind the opioid use disorder that's completely treatable. My colleague had mentioned about 2 of the key medications that's been found in decades of scientific research to be highly effective. And we certainly see this in our patients' lives when they come in sort of one day still really struggling with drug use, and then fast forward a few weeks to months are doing so much better with stability in that in the chemistry that's involved in this chronic disease. And I think one of the things that's a key message is for us to really start to think about the words that we use when we're talking about opioid use disorder. I think when we really think about empathy for the other person who is suffering from this chronic disease, really starting to refer to this as a use disorder, as a person who's suffering from it, and refrain from using some of the very stigmatizing language that we're so much more used to hearing. That's when we really begin to transform our attitudes toward this treatable condition that forms a part of our national epidemic.
Very helpful advice. Thank you, Dr. Liu. Before you go, Dr. Torres-Lockhart, can you help us just with any access to resources, a number that people can call for help, treatment, services, all that good stuff?
Yeah, great question. So as an addiction provider at Montefiore, we've really made it our priority to make sure that we sort of literally and figuratively keep our doors open during the pandemic for our patients to really ensure that they continue to have access to these life-saving medications that we've talked about, both buprenorphine and methadone. So at our 6 different primary care sites and our 5 different methadone treatment programs, we've been offering additional flexibility to patients. So we've been incorporating telemedicine into both of our practices to really allow patients to stay home when able and decrease their exposures to COVID, and really allow them to continue their treatments and continue their supports in that way. And so in doing so, we've really been able to continue to see our existing patients and care for them, but also really acquire new patients who have been interested in pursuing treatment during the pandemic. And so, like I said, you can email or call our buprenorphine treatment network. The email is bup@montefiore.org, and then we'd be happy to provide the telephone number as well. And our 5 different opioid treatment programs, also known as methadone clinics as well. Patients can call directly and set up for new patient appointments within the next few days as well. And aside from just medication treatment, so regardless of if someone wants medication or not, if they're using opioids, we also provide sort of harm reduction services for all of our patients as well. So we know that drug use sort of exists on a spectrum from totally abstinent to having a full addiction and the negative consequences with that. And anything in between can be associated with harms. And so we really make it a priority to dispense those naloxone kits that Dr. Liu had talked about to help prevent opioid overdoses. And we also encourage our patients to test their own drug supplies for fentanyl as well to really reduce the risk of overdose. And we also closely refer to our local harm reduction agencies to ensure our patients have access to sterile supplies to use drugs to really reduce the risk of any sort of infections, HIV, hepatitis C, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Torres-Lockhart and Dr. Tiffany Liu, for helping shine a light on National Addiction Treatment Week, which takes place between October 19th to the 25th. We'll be right back.
Listen up, Bronxites. Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd. Are you safely hitting the polls for in-person voting? Or are you voting absentee by mailing in your ballot? New York offers absentee ballots by mail to voters who will be unable to vote in person for any reason. Absentee voting can be confusing, but it's safe and has become more common during coronavirus due to fears of crowding when voting at poll sites. In the primary elections, more than 500,000 ballots were rejected and discarded due to human error. So before you start filling in your ballot, make sure to keep the following in mind. Fill in your bubble selections with a blue or black ink pen only. Never mark any X's or check marks as opposed to filling these bubbles in. Don't forget to sign and date the back of the ballot envelope. And finally, mail your absentee ballot before the deadline November 3rd. You can also drop it off in person at an early voting poll site between October 24th and November 1st, at a poll site on Election Day, November 3rd by 9 p.m., or at the Bronx County Board of Elections office no later than November 3rd by 9 p.m. Stay informed, stay safe, and most importantly, make sure you mail your absentee ballot or wear a mask, remain 6 feet apart, and safely head out to the polls to have your vote count and your voice heard.
Water. It's a fundamental part of human life. Yet, many people, like the indigenous population in Bolivia, have been dealing with one of the worst environmental disasters: the drying of the second largest lake in the country, Lake Popo, and the contamination of toxic chemicals in their water. UMA, A Water Crisis in Bolivia, is a documentary highlighting that story. Let's check out this trailer.
El agua es vida. Donde no hay agua, no hay vida. Nosotros aquí vivimos de los pozos, sacamos de los pozos el agua, pero el agua ya no es bebible, ni siquiera los animales pueden beber. Todas las aguas en las minas que van bajando ríos abajo son las que alimentan el lago Popó. Todas esas situaciones las hemos ido demandando, denunciando en su momento, no hemos sido escuchados hasta que se ha secado el lago Popó. Después de 50, 40 años de contaminación, necesitamos resarcimiento. Tienen que las empresas, los cooperativistas, reacondicionar la conducción de las aguas de mina, que no vayan directamente al río, todo amarillo, todo contaminado.
En esta comunidad nos encontramos sin trabajo. Nos ha abandonado nuestra madre tierra, nuestro Pachamama, nuestra cota maecota.
Es como si la minera fuera una ametralladora y nos aniquilara a todos los comunales.
Es un sector productivo que no solamente mejora su situación económica, sino también mejora la economía nacional. ¡Que vivan las mineras y palleras de Bolivia! ¡Que vivan en Comín! ¡Que viva nuestro proceso de cambio! Muchas gracias.
Acá, hermano, el Illimane, en extensión, más de 10 empresas chinas dominan las explotaciones en Bolivia. Los químicos, explosiones están matando la montaña.
Nuevamente está queriendo ocurrir el saqueo de nuestros recursos naturales como en los tiempos coloniales. Y han capturado aguas subterráneas, más va a ir secando. Ya es basta.
Ya hemos hecho nuestras denuncias, nuestras demandas a las Naciones Unidas, ¿a dónde más podemos ir?
Lo que importa es que la tierra se ha secado, el lago se ha muerto, se han muerto los peces. ¿Y quién defiende todo esto?
Joining us now to discuss her debut feature documentary is independent documentary filmmaker and journalist Ana Llácer. Welcome, Ana. Muchas gracias. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Of course. Just to start off, we just saw the trailer for your film. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? UMA, A Water Crisis in Bolivia.
Yes, so UMA, A Water Crisis in Bolivia follows the fight of 3 indigenous communities communities in the Andes to protect their water supplies from diversion and mining contamination amid a national water crisis. So I started to investigate at the end of 2015 when Lake Popo, the second largest lake in the country after Lake Titicaca, dried up.
Gracias, Ana. What exactly is causing the water crisis in Bolivia, and how long have the indigenous people living there faced this crisis?
So Bolivia was affected by one of the worst droughts in 25 years between 2016 and 2017, and the government declared a state of emergency in November 2016 that lasted over 100 days. So it affected all the major cities in the country and affected more than 25,000 families. So the documentary was filmed between those years in the Altiplano, in the highlands of the country, which is a region is very affected, highly affected by the effects of El Niño and La Niña. And there's like a chronic drought going on. So they have, because this area is already very dry, so they have like a chronic drought and it's affected by these climate phenomenon, El Niño, La Niña. So I started to investigate at the end of 2015 when Lake Popo dry up, and I found out that around this lake there's many mining operations working on extracting mineral, and these mining operations use huge amounts of water for their operations and for their production, and they divert the water that is supposed to go to Lake Popo. So, and also they dispose all their mining waste into the rivers that flow into Lake Popo. So all these heavy metals leak into the indigenous communities' wells because they live from the wells. They take the water from the soil, and that affects their health. They cannot grow food anymore, and they are forced to migrate to bigger cities. Yeah.
And Ana, you found the main character, Maria Luisa. What drew you to her and her story in particular, and how did you find Maria Luisa for the story?
So I met Maria Luisa through the FEDIP, which is the Bolivia's Documentation and Information Center. They actually are interviewing the documentary, and they are researchers, and they are at the forefront in the fight against environmental abuses and violations of indigenous human rights. Her story is very inspiring because she's been fighting for many years to stop a mining company from contaminating the waters of the Wiña and Jauira River, which passes through Querarani, which is her community, and flows directly into Lake Popo. So Maria Luisa, when I met her, she already filed several claims against this mining company in the Oruro department, which is the region where Lake Popo is. It's called Oruro. It's like a state. And against this, she filed claims against this mining company. And after this, she was beaten and received death threats from the miners, and even some members of her community have neglected her as well. And Querarani has been separated. The miners are creating conflict to the legitimize, Maria Luisa, and so the community supports another leader closer to the mining company. So it's like a fight of interest here, because these are really poor communities. So the miners usually offer jobs to a lot of members in the community, so they get in fights, and it's like really sad.
Right. A lot of people have a hard time seeing how this is an issue, right? How the mining is an issue because it brings money and maybe
exactly
into the community, but at the same time, it's taking away the fundamental water, the human right of the water of the indigenous people. Thank you for sharing that, Ana. You have a record of addressing themes of social justice and environmental sustainability as a filmmaker. Can you please tell us the importance of this work, of being a documentary filmmaker in this field?
Right. So To me, like every corner of the globe is facing the environmental impacts of human greed. So mineral, oil, and gas extraction contribute to forest loss, greenhouse gas emissions, and are exacerbating inequalities and further depriving people of their livelihood, especially indigenous communities. So the poor and marginalized suffer first, but we are all impacted. So that's what I think we need: bold climate solutions in order to shift public opinion and challenge decision makers, the systems and the practices. No, I believe that making environmental and human films is one of the best ways to do so, to bring attention, to create awareness.
Absolutely. And Anna, did you personally face any challenges while filming Uma? Please share, if any.
Yeah, it was very difficult to get indigenous people, indigenous communities to open up and talk in front of a camera. Even some NGOs and organizations that work with these contamination issues and with water didn't want to talk to me. One of the main issues is that they are afraid of retaliation. There has been a lot of censorship from the government of Evo Morales through his presidency. So when you speak up about environmental issues, you have many enemies, even within the communities, you know, because the majority of the members of the community support Evo Morales party, which is like the first indigenous president. When this documentary was filmed, he's not now in power. When the documentary was filmed, he was in power. So, for example, Maria Luisa has received the hatred of many people in her community, friends, relatives, including her brothers who have beaten her up, beaten in her own house. She has received death threats by minors who have threatened her and other community members with dynamite. So it's like a dangerous when you speak up about these kind of issues, because it's like an economic force and the people are really poor. So it's like a lot of disputes, you know, it's complicated.
There's this activism behind the work that Maria Luisa is doing there.
Yeah.
You know, can you tell me how she feels about sharing her story with the world? Because now, you know, this film is premiering in the Wildlife Conservation Film Festival. Congratulations to you and
Thank you so much.
And the indigenous community for spreading the message to the world. How is she and the indigenous community feeling after the film was completed?
So she's really happy because somebody like me has taken interest in her story, because she's been doing activism for almost 10 years. And these are really isolated communities in the Altiplano, in the highlands, in the Andes of Bolivia. So usually they don't receive much media attention. A lot of local papers or local media don't cover these things. So if they cover, they don't really, because they are really used to it. It's like something that they normalize, like mining contamination, water scarcity, water shortage is normal for them. So she's actually really happy. We had like an event in September around Climate Week with Weekend International, which is an organization that works here in the United States with indigenous communities, and Reacción Climática, which is another organization that works in Bolivia. And they invited us to talk, and she was really happy to, you know, tell her story and, you know, be finally heard by somebody. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you, Ana, for your work and for highlighting Maria Luisa's story. One last thing before we go. In the United States, many of us are privileged to have water, and we often take it for granted. We're lucky to have clean water supplies, while Bolivia deals with the lack of water to drink. As Maria said in the film, not even animals can drink this water. What do you hope that people with plenty of access to clean, drinkable water take away from the film?
Well, here in the United States, there are many problems with water as well. Look what happened in Flint, Michigan. And last month in September, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, made a rollback of the clean water rules official, repealing the 2015 protections of the Obama era regulation, that had enhanced protections for wetlands and smarter waterways. So the Trump administration is changing the definition of what qualifies as water of the United States in an effort to fast track oil and gas pipelines. So here in the United States, there's a lot of problems too. I mean, what I really want people to get is like, that our consumerism is highly affecting the livelihoods of a lot of people, and mostly indigenous people, and their right to food sovereignty and self-determination. So it's not only happening in Bolivia, it's happening here. Look what is going on in California too. They have water shortages too. So I think this is a global issue and it has to be addressed. I think people are really used to open, drink tap water, or open the water fountain, and they don't really realize how lucky we are. But the thing is that the population globally, we are growing, and the water is getting, the water shortages, and there's more demand than water that we have. So I think we have to be really thoughtful and be aware of how important water is for every human being and every being in the planet.
Absolutely. Gracias. Thank you, Ana, for your time today and for sharing more about your film, UMA, A Water Crisis in Bolivia.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Folks, you can watch UMA, A Water Crisis in Bolivia through the Wildlife Conservation Film Festival between October 1st to November 8th. Please visit WCFF.org and umadocumentary.com for more information. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Shifting Streams is a new art exhibit bringing together a group of 12 artists of Cuban origins who live and work on the west bank of the Hudson River, New Jersey. And you don't have to leave your home to see it. This exhibit is virtual at the Longwood Art Gallery's first ever 3D virtual space presented by Hostel Center for the Arts and Culture and Bronx Council on the Arts. Joining us now to share more is curator and art writer Meyken Barreto. Meyken, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Of course. Well, first, we gave a little introduction, but congrats on being the first art curator to grace the Longwood Art Gallery's virtual space. And can you tell us a little bit more about Shifting Streams?
Sure. So Shifting Streams, as you have already said at the beginning, brings together the work of these 12 artists that works and live in New Jersey, basically in that area of Union City, West New York, which is on the side of the river, and it's a growing community of artists of Cuban origins that have been settled there for a while. So in a way, this exhibition wants to highlight that community, to show the work of some of the artists, because there are a lot of other creative that lives there, but basically of these 12 artists from New Jersey.
Thank you, Meyken. And from what I've read, those artists don't have a lot of exposure there where they live to showcase their art. So you're opening the space virtually so more people can enjoy their work and view it as well, no?
Yes. Well, actually, it's kind of difficult to live in that area of New Jersey, as you don't have the visibility that you might have if you live in Brooklyn or Queens or another areas in New York. So this is actually the second time that an exhibition is done with a group of artists from that area. The first one was in Miami some time ago, and the idea is to highlight, that phenomenon. The exhibition was originally planned to take place in the actual space of the gallery, but due to the changes with the COVID-19 crisis and everything, we came up with the idea of doing a virtual show.
Welcome to the Bronx, to all those Cuban artists from Hudson, New Jersey. Meyken, I wanted to ask you, what are the types of mediums and the themes that artists explore in this exhibit? We read also that some of the pieces in the show were also created in quarantine during COVID-19. Can you share more?
Yeah. Well, for this exhibition, I choose some recent works by these artists. And as you walk through the gallery, you realize that they have very different styles, very different topics from, the individual, the relationship, the social relationships, the intimate relationship between human beings. Some of them are exploring the space, the landscape, the technology, even the dreams, the cultural spaces. There are many different subjects that they are exploring. I try to organize the exhibition in a way that it's easy to travel around and get, a first section is dedicated more to individuals, to the human beings, to the self. And then there's a second moment more associated to spaces, domestic settings, the space of nature, the space of technological landscapes, and so on. So that's basically like two segments I try to organize with the exhibition, so it's easier to navigate there. But yes, specifically the works of Danai Bigoa, one of the artists in the exhibition, was created during the confinement due to COVID-19. It's interesting because before this moment, she was only creating artworks that were text-based. And this is the first moment in which she started to paint her own image. These are self-portraits. So in a way, this was a moment for her to explore her inner self, to explore her image. She had time to do that. And also to create a sort of statement around the idea of the culture of selfies today. She's doing a different kind of selfie where she's looking at herself through this slow process of a painting. And if you look at the artworks, you realize she's also recreating a sort of multifold nature of herself with different faces and associated with social medias and so on.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing, Meyken. Can you also share a few other pieces in the show and tell us a little bit about those artists and their work? Maybe 1 to 3 pieces if you can.
Yeah, sure. Well, for example, I think it's interesting. Well, all of them are very interesting, but in that same idea of self-portraits and portraits, we have the work of Alain Pino, which is creating these portraits of historical figures, American historical figures, but also figures associated today with economy because they are printed in the bills, in the currency that we use every day. And he has created this sort of self-interpretations, his own versions of these figures, where in the part of the mouth, in that area where the mouth and the neck would be, he had created this sort of metallic structure that is the materialization of the wave of the sound of a word. So his way of make an encryption, something that is secret, a word, a message that it's there, but we don't know what it is because it's encrypted in that structure. And then we have the work of Javier Caso, photography, and it's quite interesting because in this case, he explored domestic spaces. He used to work on maintenance on some houses, and he took this picture without the permission of the owner. So he's trying to question the idea of private property. And nowadays, when we have so many technologies that are all the time trying to get into our private spaces. And then, for example, we have the work of Kenia Arguiñao, which is a different type of exploration. It's more dedicated to the space of the self, but in this case of the dreams. She has been working for years with her own dreams, creating calendars, graphics, statistics, journals, everything exploring her own dreams in order to know herself better. And in this case, you have this like abstract structure where you find a lot of numbers, and those are the collection of the dates of those days when she doesn't remember what she has dreamed. So as you see, it's a wider range of topics and styles in this exhibition.
All beautiful pieces that we just showed to the viewer as well. You can view them virtually, of course. Meyken, can you walk us through the experience, the virtual experience? Can people still read about the artist online and, click and engage with the art? Please tell us more about the virtual exhibit.
Well, let me start by the beginning. You just have to go to the website of the Hostos Center for the Arts and click on the exhibit page. There you will find the title of the exhibition. And when you click there, you have the visual experience in front of you. You can put it like full screen. And then you are at the entrance of the exhibition. There you can read a wall text about the show, and you can also see a video. There's a small icon on the side of the text where you can see the videos with the opening remarks. If you turn around, you see the list of artists on the other wall. And in the area of the reception, you have a small video that actually have some instructions on how to navigate the space. But it's very intuitive, really. I am very grateful to the team of Art Visualism who created this experience with me. And they made it in a very easy way. So you just have to walk through those circles that are on the space, on the floor, and you can approach the artworks, zoom in or out. And there's a small icon on the side of every artwork where you can read the label, you can read the caption with all the information of the artwork.
Thank you, Meyken. So all you have to do is bring your own bottle of wine and sit down at your computer.
Yay.
Watch the art virtually with no problem. Were there any challenges behind curating an art exhibit virtually, or have you done it before? How has this been different for you?
Yeah, this has been completely new for me. You know, we were planning to do this in the actual side of the gallery, as I said before. So in the summer, we realized this was not possible. So I came up with that idea of creating a sort of visual experience that I have seen in other spaces for art fairs and so on. And the gallery, the director of the gallery agreed with the idea. So I started working with this team, and it was a little bit different, of course. We didn't have to hang the works there. We didn't have to print things or be in the space to get a better sense of it and change things at the last moment or anything like that. So, but it's a very interesting experience, and I think this is here to stay. You know, even if we get back to some sort of normality, there are things that you can get here with these kind of exhibitions that, for example, can reach people in every country in the world, can come and see the show, things that were not possible before, and I'm very happy with the results.
That is so true. And I was definitely curious about that. I thought that the art was actually hanged at the Longwood Art Gallery and then you took photos of it, but it's all literally virtually done.
Everything. Yeah, we couldn't get there.
That's okay. You still have, you know, as an art curator, I know that you still take care of those pieces in your inbox, in your email, as opposed to physically, you know, holding on to them. Is that different for you too?
Yeah, fortunately, I'm very familiar with these artists, and I have visited some, you know, all of them, and I have seen the works in person. But of course, it's been challenging to work with these pieces only with the images, and especially challenging for the people who's actually approaching this type of experience, because, you know, that direct contact with the artwork, it's something that you cannot get from this type of experience. But anyway, I think it's been a very good way to bring the art to the people.
Absolutely. Meyken, before we go, what do you hope that people can take away from viewing Shifting Streams?
Well, I hope that the people can connect with some of the artworks there, depending on their history, on their experiences of life, on their opinions of things. I hope they can, you know, connect and have this inner conversation with some of the artworks in the exhibit and get those messages with them, because there are a lot of interesting explorations here in terms of concepts in the artworks. But also, you know, that idea of shifting streams. This is a community of thriving artists, immigrant artists, that at some point had to change their lives and circumstances and emigrate. And now we're in this moment also of shifting our dynamics, of changing our lives, not geographically, but, you know, the dynamics of our society due to this situation. So in a way, this is a message of also of optimism in that sense.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Meyken Barreto. She is the art curator for Shifting Streams. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks to you.
Folks, again, you can visit Shifting Streams. It'll be on display online from October 7th to December 9th. You can check it out by visiting the Longwood Art Gallery virtually on hostos.cuny.edu/culturearts and click exhibits. That's all for our show today. Thank you for tuning in to BXRx. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, wishing you and your family safety and wellness now and always.